So yeah, Season 2, Episode 6 of House of the Dragon. This episode offers a lot of my favorite traits of a Game of Thrones episode, but nothing is perfect. Now don't get me wrong, I have a lot of compliments for this episode, but there's also a couple critiques. I also have some questions, and then we have the last few minutes of this episode that I think will make or break the episode for fans, depending on how you view it. And I can't wait to share with you my thoughts on the ending of this episode and everything that came before it right now. I love the Green Council under the leadership of Daemon, and really from the moment Viserys died in Season 1, I think it's easily been the most dynamic of the two factions, if only in the vacuum of these council scenes. It's such a contrast compared to Aegon. Daemon talks past interruptions, he assumes authority regardless of counsel, and places a very distinct tone on each of these scenes. His strategy is questioned, but only from characters like Criston Cole and Alicent, who've realized that anointing Daemon as regent has essentially reduced the council to a very single-minded dictatorship, of which nobody holds power beyond Daemon. It's a fairly alarming prospect, and it seems everyone in these council meetings are coming to terms with this. Criston Cole seems greatly impacted still from the battle at Rook's Rest, and there's almost this sense of trembling fear among those sitting at the council. Daemon's strategy for battle with the Lannisters and Criston Cole's army is very risky, and other than Larys Strong agreeing seemingly to remain in good faith or good standing with Daemon, nobody else believes at this table that Daemon's plan is actually a good idea, yet they can only half-heartedly oppose the idea. Alicent being spoken over and outright ignored perfectly demonstrates how beyond control Daemon truly is. It is simply his way or nothing. The concerns over trusting the Triarchy or marching on Harrenhal both present obvious risks that Daemon refuses to acknowledge. Removing Alicent from the council, I believe, is about more than just Daemon refusing to heed her advice, but I'll elaborate on that in just a moment. I want to jump over to the Black Council. If there's an area that I feel tired by or disinterested in, it is the lack of tension or real conflict beyond bickering or repeating the same loop since episode 2. The council wants to be more aggressive, and Rhaenyra wishes to be maybe more diplomatic if possible. But it's not just that. There seems to be an unwillingness to recognize Rhaenyra as an intimidating leader who commands authority, because now that she does take measures to be more aggressive, like sending a dragon to Rook's Rest, or the idea of getting Sir Darkland to claim Sea Smoke, it is labeled as spectacle by Bartimos Celtigar. The reason this episode felt refreshing to me for the Black Council isn't that it speeds up or that Rhaenyra has a sudden shift in her character, but things finally get a bit more interesting as far as development. The idea of attaining new dragon riders is being explored. Sir Darkland, a willing participant, is ultimately burned alive and killed. Now, I've been eager to see the Dragon Seeds plot play out, knowing that it will take some creative liberties from the book and do their own thing here in House of the Dragon. This plot is beginning to unfold here in episode 6, and maybe some feel this is moving too slow. But if you didn't learn anything from Game of Thrones, I think fans need to recognize that the damage you can do narratively from executing ideas too quickly in a rush fashion is almost impossible to repair later, or you also run the risk of having characters show up with little or no development or an organic introduction, even though they're vital to your story. Now, I'm sure a lot of show-only fans are baffled by the idea that Alicent actually has a third son from Viserys. This is a Targaryen prince with a dragon of his own who's never mentioned in Season 1. And if you look at the pace of Season 1, you can see why it was almost impossible to introduce Daemon, Alicent's youngest son. But in this season, while you may think it's moving at a snail's pace, it offers time and flexibility to avoid that kind of situation. And by situation, I mean the mistake of nobody mentioning Daemon until episode 2 of this season. My point is that if we move too fast with some of these ideas, we end up getting multiple contrivances in the development of our plot. Dragging out Rhaenyra's Black Council is just not a deadly sin in writing compared to the other end of the spectrum, rushing. One moment I truly loved is when Bartimos Celtigar is rambling on with his criticisms of Rhaenyra's decision making, and she just turns around and slaps him. This is an outward expression of an internal frustration, and it's the first time we've seen this from Rhaenyra. Now, if this goes to an extreme level in the future, the idea of Rhaenyra being pushed to the edge is being established right now, and I'm here for it. The one issue I do have at the Black Council in this episode is a total lack of tension between Rhaenyra and Corlys. I thought this internal conflict for the Blacks was important in the book, but it seems to have just been given to Bartimos Celtigar and Alfred Broom. It's just not as personal as Corlys blaming Rhaenyra for the death of Rhaenys. So I think it's time to check in on Daemon at Harrenhal. Again, I get it that people might be tired of this plot, and in fairness, after episode 5, I also started to feel critical of this. But I feel like this episode is finally beginning to give us a bit of payoff for all of this buildup. But because Daemon's visions have overstayed their welcome in the eyes of some fans, they may not have appreciated Daemon's plot in this episode. Going back to a vision from season 1 and Daemon reliving that moment, we're watching Daemon finally consider the perspective of his brother. It's not that we need to establish that Daemon actually cares for his brother either. We already know that from season 1. What Daemon is coming to terms with is how he has emotionally betrayed both Viserys and Rhaenyra in pursuit of his own rise. I think the scene with his mother in episode 5 was kind of a twisted version of him feeling overlooked and yet somehow a more desirable son. That he viewed himself as being born the second son as a mistake by the gods maybe. I'm speculating a bit here, and I think that's a good thing, that there can be multiple interpretations. But what I believe Daemon is realizing is that Viserys did in fact need him, and as powerful and fearsome as he is, being of service to his family was just too selfless, and he wished to expand his own glory and legend selfishly. And when this did not offer him contentment, he would just simply run away. So when Daemon awakened from this vision, he has this fantastic mental breakdown in front of Simon Strong. The first thing he does is proceed to try and bail, and that's when he encounters Alice Rivers. And I like, even if I don't love Alice Rivers, because she is becoming vital to this transformation of Daemon. She essentially calls Daemon out on everything that is obvious on the surface, plus she pushes against maybe some of his internalized insecurities that nobody else knows. It makes the audience really wonder, what exactly are Alice's capabilities? The last thing I want to say is that we do see Daemon cry from the impact of witnessing Viserys cry over Emma Aaron's body. Is he crying out of regret, guilt, compassion, or perhaps he's hit his breaking point in the mental and emotional confrontation with himself? I like to think it's all of the above. Now, I said I have questions, and Alicent goes to see Gwayne Hightower, her brother, and she asks about Otto. Now, I understand keeping things a mystery, but knowing that Otto left to go to Highgarden and acknowledging that there's a conflict between the Tyrells and the Beesburys in the Reach, I'd really like to know what he's up to. Not seeing Rhys Ifans since his masterclass scene with Aegon in episode 2 has been kind of disappointing. Now, I know many people love this scene, and I really love a lot that is just visually communicated by Gwayne Hightower. This character has physically evolved from who he was when he arrived in King's Landing in episode 3. This character has been to war, and considering the almost smug persona he brought into this season compared to where he is now, truly adds to the weight of going to battle, and he wears these expressions on his face that communicate everything that he's been through and everything that he's seen, and yet also in a way he'd never be able to describe it. Even though this scene is being praised by many, I do feel that it's having to carry some extra work that should have occurred in season 1 as we continue to learn more of this mysterious third son. My issue as a reader of the book is that this character matters at least as much as other characters, if not more, and yet we've gotten extended time with like Ulf the White or Hugh Hammer, but Daemon is only mentioned at times that feel a bit jarring because a show-only fan didn't even know he existed until this season started. He's 16, he's been around for a while. Nobody thought mentioning him before now mattered, but is that the fault of this episode? No, I blame season 1. It just would have enhanced a scene like this, I think. Now, Alicent stares off at Kristen and Kristen stares off at Alicent right before he leaves. They make eye contact, and I don't know how that's a complete story for these two. I don't like that relationship is basically inconsequential moving forward. I'd say I want closure for this relationship, but we really don't even have a great framing of what they were or how it truly became romantic or when they first crossed that line. I mean, we didn't even get to see their first kiss. But you know whose first kiss we did get to see? That's right, Rhaenyra and Mysaria. And I'm going to get to that in just a second. I want to briefly touch on that second scene with the Green Council. Aemond versus Larys. I love that Aemond is not here to be pandered to or have anyone shower him with false approval or snakish characters looking to propel their own agenda. Larys looks to manipulate Aemond as he did with Aegon by mentioning that Aemond needs to have a hand of his own. Larys quickly realizes after being called a toad by Aemond that the one brother is not like the other. This better establishes a clear standing for Aemond among these political players that he is a force that will not bend to the will of those he doesn't see as aligned with his own vision. Now this also plays well for Larys when he goes to visit Aegon. And I want to cover Aegon's visit with both Aemond and Larys here together. Aegon does remember precisely what occurred at Rook's Rest, and he is clearly horrified by Aemond. And this scene lends itself to cementing Aemond as not just a threat to the Blacks, but much so to the detriment of any alternative interests among the Greens. So I believe that this is the final moment we'll actually need to establish this for Aemond's character. But what I think I will be most interested in seeing is how this is challenged if Otto Hightower comes back, if Aemon does go to Harrenhal. Perhaps what has been a wild experience for Daemon will be paralleled for Aemond when he goes to Harrenhal. We'll have to wait and see. And it'll be interesting to see how these two characters contrast each other's experiences. The show clearly wants us to see similarities and draw comparisons between Aemond and Daemon, and I'm excited to see where this goes. Now, a great scene comes here between Larys and Aegon. Larys offers a bit of a reintroduction to himself for Aegon. While we are finding Larys humanizing himself a little bit, it's not entirely clear what ulterior motives may be at play for his character. However, I do believe there's a part of this that is sincere. Both Aegon and Larys know that Aemond is fierce and as much of a threat as the Blacks at this point to their own individual safety. While it is for different reasons, as Larys may simply be a person Aemond doesn't trust, Aemond's animosity toward Aegon is certainly due to some bullying, but I believe it's bigger than that. I believe Aemond is insulted that such a buffoonish and non-serious person such as Aegon would be anointed king, as he is entirely unequipped to rule. Comparatively with Aemond, he has followed his duty at every turn to be one of the greatest assets to his family. But I also enjoyed this scene as a book fan, and I don't want to spoil anything, but I find it intriguing to see small moments between two characters that can potentially establish something very peculiar in the future, and I'm anxious to see how these small details impact much bigger moments. Now, The Small Folk is obviously the title for this episode, and it is appropriate in a lot of ways as we get to explore these living conditions and overall environment, as well as the temperament of the Small Folk. These characters seem inconsistent in their loyalty, and I do believe that is intentional. To start the season, they are given promises by the king that are not fulfilled. Then when tragedy strikes Prince Jaehaerys, they do mourn for him and his loss, but then their sons, fathers, brothers, etc. were brutally hanged simply for being rat catchers. The blockade has prevented them attaining food and nourishment. While this should be blamed on Rhaenyra, the broken promises combined with the brutality shown to the rat catchers, also combined with what they see as an omen for killing Meleys, the small folks' loyalty to the Greens is evaporating. and after being essentially imprisoned into the city, receiving the gift of food from Rhaenyra was a perfect way to cause a stir, where a riot breaks out because even with his gift, it's not enough, which creates hostility, while it still simultaneously is earning Rhaenyra good faith for at least trying. Now, when Alicent and Helaena try to flee the small folk, they are calling out praise for Rhaenyra, so it really does show how the small folk have kind of changed their perspective on the Greens versus the Blacks. I really did enjoy this episode, but there are a couple issues I have, and right here where we left off is one with Helaena. I want more Helaena. She's been given the gift of premonitions or visions, but if they do not expand more on this and give her something more to do that feels focused on her own plot, I'm struggling to see a competent arc for this character. And not every character truly needs an arc, but House of the Dragon has introduced these elements to this character that gives her far more potential than her book counterpart, and I'm just getting impatient waiting to see them do something interesting with all of that. We'll see what happens. Another issue I would have is kind of the plot there occurring in the Vale. I am interested in a potential wild dragon, although I don't think this is entirely a wild dragon. I believe I know which dragon it is, and that will be a change a little bit from the books, and that's fine. But I want to get to know the Vale better, and I want to feel the significance of Jane Eyre and what motivates this region of Westeros. I don't mind visiting the Vale, but I don't want to show up here simply to be told what is going to happen next. I think the Vale is a fascinating place in A Song of Ice and Fire, and I just want that explored a little bit more. I do like Rhaena's role here. I just want to see Jane Eyre offer something a bit more interesting. Perhaps this wild dragon plot will offer us this. Look, this isn't horrible, the Vale's not horrible, and I'm kind of being nitpicky here, but that's just kind of my thoughts when I watch those scenes. So let's wind this one down by focusing on the last few minutes of this episode. And yeah, I'll talk about that one scene. I like what we're getting with Alan and Adam of Hall a lot. I think it will impact Corlys Velarion's character long term. I like that we know that they are actually the sons of Corlys, but what's really interesting is that Adam doesn't have the same silver hair, and yet later, Seasmoke essentially reverses the roles, and it seems like he claims Adam of Hall as his rider, instead of the rider claiming the dragon. And I don't have any criticisms of this other than I don't actually know how this will play into the rules of dragon bonding. It's known that the Velaryon aren't exactly dragon riders unless a marriage with a Targaryen comes into play. But also there's questions about Seasmoke's bond to Laenor, and how can he accept another rider. But here's the thing, in both House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones, these rules are all over the place, and in the context of both of these shows, there are no official rules that we can say are concretely in place. I say that to say that I really do not mind this. I like the idea of kind of playing up an underdog role for Alan and Adam of Hall, even if it means that a certain character book fans were anticipating will ultimately be cut from the show and some of their themes are going to be spread out among the other characters. Alright, I guess we have to talk about that kiss between Rhaenyra and Mysaria, don't we? I watched that scene and I thought that in this season, Rhaenyra has expressed some sincere thoughts and feelings, ultimately making herself vulnerable to Mysaria, where Mysaria, I believe, has taken advantage of this to further her own interests, and perhaps her interests might actually be aligned with Rhaenyra's. Maybe. Then Mysaria in this episode offers some background on herself, really revealing that she's been victimized by her own father, and that she has a very troubled past. But that Rhaenyra has earned her admiration and loyalty because she believes that Rhaenyra is capable of offering an alternative future for the common born that has not been afforded yet by anybody else. Then these two hug and ultimately they kiss. Now, you could argue that this is problematic because the sexual tension between these two characters has just not been established, and that this is kind of shoehorned in and not really organic. What do I think about the kiss? Well, I heard that this was just a spontaneous thing that these two actors did in the moment, and that's fine, but if there's zero narrative reason for leaving it in, then yes, I think it's a mistake. If they have found a narrative justification for it, then it's fine. If you start making the conversation bigger than that, I'd recommend that you step outside and get yourself some fresh air, because this controversial moment is just not that serious. The show has already made huge mistakes that nobody seems to care about anymore. I hear people are upset about it or critical of it, and I think people have a higher standard for this series than any other series before it, and you're always going to be disappointed if you're expecting something to be flawless. I thought it was much better than last week, but that's that for episode 6 of season 2. You can go ahead and click here now for more on House of the Dragon.